Hi, it's Barbara Bunzy at the Sign of the Calico Goose. Going to be working on a pretty simple Christmas design, but I think it has a lot of impact. Let me tell you first that we are filming this during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, and so we've moved our operations outside. So if you hear birds or cars, that's what's going on. But I hope it might help you enjoy the video a little bit more and bring a little bit of summertime to this Christmas design. Okay, so this is a tray that I found at Hobby Lobby. It was already painted with the gold and kind of antiqued here, and it's a plastic tray, but I really loved it, and I just felt it needed some kind of a cool design on it, and that's why I decided to use this. Now, because the tray is plastic, the paint would not be sticking to it. So the first thing I did was I used some Deco Art Media Matte Medium on the floor of the tray. This makes it a little, gives it a little bit more tooth to it. Also, I used some tape along the edges here. I'm going to get this in real well. You can get the idea. So you want to tape off the edge of the tray and really press it hard. I like to use my fingernail. And then when I did the matte medium, I brought that up a little bit. So when I was brushing it on, I brought it up a little bit this way to seal the edge of my tape. And then that helps to prevent the paint from seeping through, even though sometimes a little bit may, but it will keep most of the paint from seeping through. You need to let that dry really, really well, because it does have kind of a tacky feel to it if you don't. So I would suggest doing it and letting it cure overnight even. Then, just to make sure that my paint would adhere to the surface well, with my first base coat, which in this case was Deco Art Camel, I added some Deco Art paint adhesion medium. So you want to do it approximately 1:1, 1 part paint to 1 part paint adhesion medium for your first coat. You don't need to add it to the second coat, but for the first coat you need to do that. And then my second coat obviously was just plain camel. And then you're going to want to take your tape off. I like to do it anyway as soon as that step is done. And then if there are any edges that the paint bled through, I just take a damp brush, just wet it in my water tub, and you just kind of clean it up. Now, I will say that I did have a little hard time to get the tape off a little bit, maybe because of the matte medium that I used. So I don't have one here with me, but you can take an X-Acto knife, because that's what I did, and just run it right along the edge between the edge of your painting and the edge of the tape, and then that allowed me to take the tape off really easily. Okay, and speaking of the background, I wanted to give this piece, since it looks like cross-stitching, which is something else I really love to do, I wanted to give a textured background here to kind of mimic what the linen or whatever fabric you use when you're doing your cross-stitching. So in order to do that, I used a wash of paint and my graining comb. And for me, the side here with the rounded edges is what works the best for me. So let's get started. So my base coat, my first base coat was camel. My second coat is going to be Deco Art Sand. I'm using a sponge brush. I'm wetting that in my water and squeezing it in, because I want to thin this paint down. If you thin it down too much, you're not going to be able to see any texture, not enough, and it's not going to move for you. Okay, let's give this a shot and see how it works. If it's too thin, I can always add more paint to it. If it's too thick, obviously I can add more water to it. So I'm going to come over here to my surface and just brush the paint on. Doesn't matter which direction you go with this. That should be pretty good, I hope. I'm going to blot my brush a little. It's a little too thin for me. So I'm going to sop some of this excess paint up, and let's see what happens. So again, I'm using my graining tool. I'm going to just lay it down and press and pull. Now every time I swipe, I just blot it on my paper towel. Come back down, pull again, and blot it on my paper towel. You might need to do this a couple of times just so you can see where the texture is. I hope you can see a little bit here where you have a little bit of that camel showing through. I'm going to do it one more time. And here's another thing that I did. If it's not showing up well enough for you, I'm just putting out a little bit more sand on my palette. I'm taking my painting comb, my comb tool, and getting some water and some extra paint to it. Again, I'm just going to dab it on my paper towel and come here and add a few extra lines. I think you can see how that's working. Ideally, you want to let this layer dry, but just to save a little bit of time, again, I'm just loading it in my paint, dabbing on my paper towel. After this, I said the first layer's dry, you want to come back and drag your comb the opposite direction. Put another layer of the wash down and drag in the opposite direction. So you've got those lines crossing as you're working on them. You can see the difference here, how you can see the texture here where the lines are kind of crossing a little bit more. And I'm going to pick up even a little more sand on my tool. And let's just drag it a little. You can see here where it caught a little bit more. And you can add some extra texture to your faux fabric here just by doing that. Let's add some coming this way. And if it gets a little blobby here, whatever, where it's kind of heavy, that's okay. It's just going to add some extra interest to the background for you. And you can just keep playing with it. You can see as my paint is drying, it's really starting to hold up better. And so you can really see where the comb came through. And you can really see that texture. Okay, we're going to put that aside. And oh, I should mention too that you might notice that I'm using my really crummy paper plate here. I'm big into recycling, and so I like to just keep recycling it until I can't use it anymore. And especially when I'm doing washes where it's going to be running all over the place, I definitely like to use my paper plate. All right, let's put that aside and let's just get started on the design. So just like with any cross stitch, we're just adding X's for the design, for the lettering. I said before, I like doing cross stitch, and I've seen some really simple cross stitch patterns with just the lettering on it, and I thought, gee, wouldn't that be a perfect painting design to do as well? And so that's how I came up with this idea. And then added not only the lettering, but a little holly and some berries up here in the corner. So we're going to start with the green stitches. And you're going to use your liner brush, obviously. And you probably remember wetting my brush when you're doing any kind of line work. you need to have extra water in your paint and brush. So I'm going to come over here to my, my paint. We're outside, so it's taking up really fast. I'm going to pull it over here and we'll just work that into my brush. I'm actually going to just tip my bristles in my water a little bit because I want it a little thinner. There we go. To make it more workable. And you can see I'm not just tipping my brush in my paint. I'm pressing it and twirling it between my fingers to load all the bristles in my brush. Okay, let's come over here to the surface, and we're just going to make some X's. So just like that. Pretty darn simple. You want to try to keep these X's as straight as you can according to the weave. So if I'm coming down and creating like the S, for example, I'm going to come down this way. Let's get some more paint. But this, you see that they're all straight. I'm not turning my X's at all. Once I get all of my green X's done, I always put a second coat on, because you can see, especially after you've made a couple, they get really thin this way. So the first layer I put down, like pulling toward myself. This time I'm going to add my X's going away from myself, so the opposite direction of the way I pulled those strokes the first time. That just cleans up any raw edges you have and gives you much better coverage than if you pulled everything straight down. And just like in cross stitching, one side or one stitch is always on top, so either it's your left to right or your right to left, and on this piece you can decide to do whatever you want. But for that, I am coming back, I'm picking up a little extra water, I'm picking up some avocado in my brush. I'm going to make a little puddle here. I'm picking up 3 parts of Hauser medium green. My paint is really tacking up outside. So I'm doing 1, 2, 3 parts of Hauser medium, and 1 part of camel, and mixing all those colors together. And you're going to have to just kind of I just gave you some approximate ratios there. Mix it up until you can see it and you're happy with it. And again, I'm mixing it in my whole brush, not just on the tip, and really mixing that paint together, not just swirling it around. I'm going to come back here to my X's, and I'm going to make my stitch from right to left be the top stitch. I'm not going to go on the right on the edge, but kind of in the middle of the stitch. I am pulling, adding a highlight. This is going to make it look like it's sitting on top. Now after that dries, I already have these done. You might decide you want to make them a little bit brighter, or maybe a little bit more green. So let's add a little more green. So I'm just going to pick up 1 more scoop of my Hauser Light green, come back to my original puddle and mix it in. And let's just add, whoops, those might be still damp. Add a little bit extra color to the top, and that'll just brighten it up a little bit and make it pop a little bit more. I actually was going to shade the bottom strokes, but it really didn't work. It didn't seem to need it, so I just left them as they are. If you think you want to add a little shading to those bottom stitches, you could just touch them with a little bit of Deco Art Evergreen. Okay, just the same as with the green. The red stitches then are done with Deco Art Heritage Brick. Again, I'm working that into my brush. And just like before, just making those X's, keeping them as straight as I can. And some cross stitch is absolutely 100% perfect, and some of it is not. So don't worry about it. If you have a couple loose edges, let's pretend that some of the fibers of the floss sticking up there. And then I'm going to come back again, add a little more color to the stitches for the second coat, coming the opposite direction. So instead of pulling top to bottom, I'm just going to add a little more paint to my brush. This time I'm pulling bottom to top. It's a little awkward for me to go this direction, so I would normally just turn my piece around. Okay, and then again we're going to add some highlight to these stitches, and this is done with one of my very favorite colors, Deco Art Scarlet. So 1 part of that to about 1 part of camel. And again, I'm mixing those colors together really, really well on my palette and in my brush. And it just tip my bristles in my water again and just mix that in so I be able to pull that color. And I'm going to come over here to the stitches I already did, and again, since my green stitches, my top stitch was the one that's right to left, I need to do the same thing with my red stitches. And I'm going to add that to the center of my red stitches. Come over here, hopefully these are dry. And you can see what a difference that makes. Just by adding that, it really makes them kind of pop out. And then the same thing, let me get my sample here for you. So you can see the 2 large letters I did with the green, the rest I did with the red. The holly is mostly green, and then the red for the berries. For the outside edges, I just used the avocado. I didn't even highlight these because I wanted my focus to be more the lettering on the inside. For me, I'm going to give you a pattern for this, but most of this I would suggest you even do freehand. When I actually did my piece, I just traced out the letters for myself and then just did the X's based on the lines of the background. Same thing up here for this border. And when I'm working on the border, or even on the X's, this is just what works for me, so I thought I'd share it with you. I put my brush down and go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And that's how I try to get my stitches to be as close to the same size as possible. They don't have to be 100% again. This is a little more whimsical piece especially, so. Okay, and then I decided we needed to add a little bit of shading to the fabric so it looks like the stitches are actually sitting on the fabric. So we're going to work on that next with a little bit of Deco Art Cocoa. And a little bit of Deco Art Espresso. And I've mentioned this to you before, but I'm going to mention it again, that the reason I keep my bottles of paint and even the medium upside down is it kind of helps block the air from getting in because everything's down at the bottom. And especially when you're trying to get that last spit of paint out of your bottle, you need to keep them upside down to keep that paint going down there. Okay, so we're going to float these colors on to add the shading underneath each stitch on the fabric. So I'm just picking up a little bit of cocoa in my brush. I'm laying it down and blending it out. Now, need a little bit more water. So I'm coming back to my water, laying it down on my paper towel. Let's pick up a little more cocoa. There we go. That's blending a lot better for me. So back and forth until I get a nice gradation of color. On the stitches that went mostly straight, I just kind of tapped underneath and added that shading. On the S, where it was kind of curving a little bit, here's a straight stitch, but then when I'm coming over here, I added it more onto the side of the stitch instead of underneath. And then obviously you're going to do the same thing to the red stitches. I'm not going to clean out my brush. I'm going to keep that cocoa in my brush. I'm going to pick up a little bit of espresso on the same corner, come back to where I blended my cocoa and blend in the espresso. That way it's not such a big jump of color. So I've got both of those colors in my brush. I'm just going to deepen my shading. Just a hair. You don't need it too dark at all. I think you can see how pretty that looks. It's really bringing those stitches out. Let's add a little bit to the red ones. This is really a very, very simple pattern. I will tell you, it does get a little tedious as you're pulling all those X's, but I think once you're done, you're going to really like it. And it's just a really simple, kind of a meditative kind of a design to be working on. So here, let me show you on my sample how here underneath my cross stitches is my shading, and then I just brought it down along the side here, kind of thinking more or less of a light source coming in from the upper left. And then on the stitches that go all the way around on the top, I did it underneath each stitch. When I came over to the side, I didn't want to come this way, so again, I just kind of tapped it. So just basically tapped my brush under each of those stitches. And basically that's all you're doing. This is the easy part. And then underneath the very bottom, I did that underneath the stitches. And you don't have to come across under every single one. Just you can kind of hit and miss a little bit. Here's a bird singing a song for you. I have a confession to make. I didn't really wait long enough to let some of my paint and mediums dry. So when I was doing my combing, I pulled some of the paint up here. So I decided let's just add an embellishment, and I think that that kind of adds a lot to the piece. And you can find these at Hobby Lobby or Michael's or any kind of craft store. And just again, just a little something to add there. You don't have to. If you want, you could even add a little extra piece of holly or some of the berries or something here. But I just thought that was kind of a fun addition to add to it. You can varnish this as soon, when you're done. Make sure you get all your pattern lines off. Make sure you sign it. You can use a brush on varnish as long as you're just using it on here. And actually, that's probably what I would suggest, because if you do a spray and you're using this tray, you're going to take the sheen off of the tray. If you're using something else, you could probably get by with a spray varnish. One of my favorite varnishes is the Deco Art Sure Touch varnish. It doesn't have a lot of sheen to it, but it just gives a very, very beautiful, beautiful finish. And you want to do that if you decide to add an embellishment. You want to do your varnishing before you glue your embellishment on. Okay, again, very quick and easy to do. Take your time with it. Maybe just practice doing some X's before you get started, and work on kind of looking at where the lines are on your faux fabric back here for placement of the stitches. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at bbunsey@calicogoose.com. When you get this piece finished, I would sure love to see some pictures, so please send some pictures there as well. And until next time, happy painting and have a merry and blessed Christmas.